By what power did you do this? This was the question the elders, rulers, scribes, and priests posed to Peter and John. They were aware that John and Peter were acting on some power, but they were not sure what this power was. It was different from the power they knew and disturbing. There may be more than one reason why they were disturbed. Peter and John were, after all, uneducated and ordinary men. Moreover, they used their power not for their own sake, but for the sake of others, like the man born lame, whose place in society was assigned to be outside the temple gates rather than inside the temple. This was probably different from the power that the leaders were familiar with. The sort of power which imprisoned people who challenged the structures and status, washed their hands off innocent people's blood like Pilate, and sentenced people to death penalty on popular demand. The theme of power is an important thread which runs through the various Bible readings that we have heard today. These readings provide valuable insights on the meaning of power and its purpose and how to use it. But some of these passages are by no means easy to understand. For example, let us pay attention to the gospel reading from John. This passage has an interesting take on power. Jesus says, "I lay down my life in order to take it up again. No one takes it from me, but I lay it down of my own accord. I have power to lay it down, and I have power to take it up again." Honestly speaking, I find this passage a bit challenging. The New Testament scholar John Barton says, "This smacks too much of an idea of Jesus as the master of his own fate, who could stage manage his own destiny. Such a picture of Jesus makes us and make him utterly unlike us." But when John talks of Jesus and his relationship to power, he often combines two ideas. One, Jesus' awareness of his power, and two, his choice about how to use it. This self-awareness of power is a common pattern in John. For example, when Jesus gets ready to wash the feet of his disciples, John writes that Jesus knew that the Father had given all things into his hands. Jesus is aware of his power. Yet he chooses to express that power by serving at the feet of his disciples and through sacrificial love. What matters with power is the way it is used. The Gospel of John also talks about the difference between a shepherd and the hired hand. What differentiates the shepherd from the hired hand is the way they use their power. The good shepherd goes to any length to ensure the safety of his flock, accompanying the sheep not only beside the green pasture and still waters, but even through the deep and darkest valleys. But the hired hand abandons his flock and seeks his own safety in times of danger. The example of how Jesus and his disciples used power speaks a lot to how we understand power and its use today. Very often, the most common experience that we find in relation to power is the temptation to abuse power. Our histories are full of people and nations who have abused power to trample others down. But this is not the only way people engage with power. The other way people engage with power is to avoid it. Archbishop Rowan Williams says, "We abuse power more by avoiding it than by abiding it or seizing it. Power frightens many because it exposes us to criticism, to the difficulties of choice." Archbishop Rowan says, "There is something bizarrely satisfying about the role of being a bystander. We can be the challengers, not the challenged, the prosecutors, not the defendant." The example of Jesus and the disciples probably helps us to think of a third way to handle power. To become aware of our power and use it not just for ourselves, but for others. When confronted with the need to act, the disciples did not avoid power by taking refuge in the idea that their hands were too tied. They did not find a home in the excuse that were the victim of circumstances and couldn't do the right thing at the right time. Rather, they recognized the power they had received and used it to make a difference. They didn't have a great big agenda, but made a difference to the small lives that mattered, like the man outside the temple gates. If we go through the book of Acts, we find that such small act of discipleship made a big difference, which disturbed the powers and ultimately made the disciples to be known as those who turn the world upside down. We are familiar with such examples in our world today. The story of Malala, the Pakistani advocate for girls' education, started off on such a small note, through a small act of going to school and writing a heartfelt diary about it for the BBC in Urdu. This brought global attention on the right to education for girls under Taliban. Small things matter. They can make a difference. Today, as we reflect on the story of the disciples, how can it speak to us? As disciples called to reflect the life of Christ, how can we live a life where we neither abuse nor avoid power? How can we be aware of this presence of power in our lives and use it with compassion and caution? The example of the disciples encourages us to make a difference, starting with a small thing. The small and simple act of faith matter. After all, the power we have received is a treasure held in clay jars, a power that is made manifest in weakness. It is a power that flows from the cross of Christ, the stone that the builders rejected, but yet became the cornerstone. It is on this cornerstone that we are called to build and lead our lives. Maybe then we can, like the disciples, recognize our power and make that small difference in things that matter. That difference which might, at some point, turn the world upside down. May this hope be our strength today and always. Amen.